Let's bring you back into studio for more analysis on this energy crisis that we're in. Energy analyst and South Africa Independent Power Producers Association committee member Brian Day and our business reporter Kopano Gumbi join us for more on the story. Brian, perhaps let me kick it off with you. You know, you have frustrated motorists sitting through traffic. That frustration is only going to grow when they get to their homes and still don't have any power. As somebody who represents the Independent Power Producers Association, what are you thinking in terms of whether or not we needed to be here in the first place?
Thank you very much, and good evening to your viewers. Indeed, it's a highly frustrating situation for everybody, and I think it's obviously unprotected strikes need to be dealt with accordingly. That we call on Eskom to redouble their efforts to bring units back to service and to minimize the unplanned maintenance issues. But the reality is that for close to a decade, we have been underinvesting in the power generation sector. We know that between 2014 and 2018, with state capture, there was a delay in the world-renowned renewable energy independent power producer procurement program. That has now been restarted. We've got, since then, the bid window 4 projects have been built. Most of them are complete and generating power onto the grid. Bid window 5 have been bid. They've been adjudicated. They are preferred bidders. Some of them will reach financial close, which is the investment decision later this month, and others are expected to reach that around September. Bid window 6 is open, and the due date is the 11th of August this year. But I think we need to really open up the power sector for private power to come to the party. We can do even more to open up the possibilities. We can remove the artificial cap on the annual generation capacities in the integrated resource plan. We can do a massive rollout under the renewables program and in the private sector. We can utilize existing power plants that are available in certain areas in the private sector that are not being procured from at the moment. And we can implement the types of technical solutions, particularly wheeling within municipalities. Wheeling, very simply, it's like using a toll road for your trucks. The municipalities have the grids, but very few of them have yet implemented more than a handful of projects. And we need to really look, as a country, focus on the crisis that we are indeed facing and look at all alternatives between the private sector, Eskom, and to really open up the building of new capacity. The existing capacity is not getting any younger, and we have an opportunity that by bringing in independent power producers to an even greater extent, we can make a massive contribution to alleviating this problem.
Sure.
Because we've got to a point where we've got no reserve margin left to accommodate crises like the unprotected strikes. So immediately something like that happens, we were already on stage 2. Before that, now we're on stage 4 and indeed stage 6. And as your intro said, it's only the second time in our history I had to actually specially activate a function on my app to be able to find stages 5 to 8.
Yeah, and that's really the issue, right? That even before we got to stage 6 and stage 4, we've been on stage 2 for quite a significant amount of time. Kopano Gumbi, Eskom, of course, right now, looking to workers to try and save the day. Let's talk about some of those discussions and the amount of success that there has been with these negotiations.
Well, Kathy, as we are now aware that at least the 2 major unions have come to the party, have said to the public that in fact they have had successful conversations or engagements today which have led to them being able to now go and put forward the revised offer to its members and to the Central Bargaining Forum this Friday, which should bring an end to this industrial action. The Minister Pravin Gordhan just really giving us a sense of how everything has unfolded in the last few days and their views on some of the challenges that they've experienced given this illegal industrial action, and really talking to some of the criminality that happened there, saying that many people were intimidated, 90% of staff at some places not being able to go into the area in the last few days, or go into any of the power stations in the last few days, and in fact coming out to now tell us that the entire security cluster will be looking into the challenges that Eskom is facing in terms of security, given that in some places they are a national key point, and so that intervention may help to protect our assets. But let's hear what he had to say about intimidation at the power station.
I would think that if we speed up some of the processes and avoid some of the red tape, if not just crack the damn red tape, forgive my poetry, then we will be able to move much faster, and within the next 2 to 3 years we will begin to see a relative level of stability as far as energy security is concerned. And let me assure you that the government as a whole recognizes the importance of energy security and is doing everything possible to amend policies, to increase, for example, investments in IPPs up to 100 megawatts, to cut red tape in various areas. And Operation Vulindlela, that is based in the presidency, is doing an exceptional amount of work in that particular area as well. So that's extremely good and urgent work that is happening now in order to facilitate quicker investments in this particular area.
For many South Africans, after 15 years of not having access to reliable power or consistent power, 15 years of load shedding, there the minister was just really giving us a sense of what they think they can do in the immediate term, after saying that we understand the situation, we've analyzed it, we know the situation at Eskom is quite dire, and now they're saying, well, perhaps we could introduce some red tape, perhaps there are other ways in which we could get more independent power producers onto the grid sooner rather than later. But he said there very interestingly, Kathy, that it will take about 2 to 3 years before we stabilize our energy supply, and whether South Africans can be that patient or continue to put up with stages 4 through 6 or possibly even 8 remains to be seen.
Brian, the real answers that South Africans are looking for here is the plans that are being made at Eskom within the Public Enterprises Department, but Cabinet as a whole, to ensure that Eskom is actually able to add more power to the grid. And that turns our focus then to the Department of Energy and Minerals and the role of Minister Gwede Mantashe in ensuring that that additional capacity actually comes on board.
Absolutely. I would applaud Minister Mantashe. I think he's got his hand on the key issues. Compliments to Operation Vulindlela. They really are starting to remove some of those hurdles. But a couple of questions. What is the importance of a 100 megawatt cap at all? It's been increased from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. Why? What is the rational reason for even limiting it to 100? Perhaps it should be 1,000 megawatts. What else can Eskom do to really beef up their capacity to connect independent power producers to the grid? Because that's the role that only Eskom can play. It's a natural monopoly owning, especially the transmission grid, and that's really something that only they can play a critical role in. Minister Gordhan talks about 2 to 3 years until we stabilize the situation. I would say that that is possible, but it's only possible if we treat it like the crisis that it is. We need to take extensive crisis intervention to make it only last 2 or 3 years. Otherwise, it'll be 5 years plus, and all of the things that the Honourable Minister was speaking about need to be done. Your question regarding the Department of DMRE, Mineral Resources and Energy, is absolutely critical. They are the custodians of energy policy rather than the Department of Public Enterprises. And that's where the Integrated Resource Plan, which is the national plan for the construction and implementation of new generation capacity in the country. I would urge Minister Mantashe to issue greater Section 34 determinations for new build, that to have around 7, 8, 9, 10 hot on the heels of each other, much bigger than they are at the moment, update the IRP so that we have a real plan for the country, because there's a couple of horrible errors in the current integrated resource plan. Specifically, assumptions around the energy availability factor. It's something that's well known to all parties, that the assumption that was made was far higher than reality. That means that the answer to that modeling gave a much lower requirement for new build capacity. If you put the right boundary condition in, you would get an answer that looks much more at reality around the extent of new build capacity that's required. So absolutely, Minister Mantashe and his department are at the center of it, and I would implore the department to really lift the lid on new procurement, both in terms of the renewables program, which is government procured, where Eskom is the buyer, but to continue to work with Operation Vulindlela as they have already, because let's not forget, it was Minister Mantashe who implemented the Schedule 2 amendment that lifted the cap to 100 megawatts. Let's lift it more. Let's make it 500. Let's make it 1,000. And let's bandy together as South Africans to resolve the crisis that we're in.
Well, speaking of Minister Gwede Mantashe, let me bring in Kevin Mileham, who's the DA Shadow Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. Kevin, of course, you're calling for the minister to go. Why?
Good evening, Kathy. Yes, I listened to your last guest with interest. I disagree. I don't think Gwede Mantashe has his hand on the issues in our electricity crisis in South Africa. I think the problem that we have is one of the ANC and the various Ministers of Energy's own making. So I totally agree that Eskom is not going to resolve our crisis, that we need to bring more independent power producers online. But what we saw in bid window 5, which, by the way, was 7 years after bid window 4 closed. Remember that the ANC and Eskom put a halt on the connection of new independent power producers in 2015, and it only reopened that early this year when new bid window 5 was opened. But in bid window 5, 2,500 megawatts, 2,542 megawatts to be precise, of electricity generation was procured. Here's the interesting thing. 9,000 odd megawatts of electricity were offered. Now you'd think that in a crisis of the nature that we have, where industry is grinding to a halt, people are unable to go about their daily lives, we would be connecting every single megawatt we can to the grid, that we would be securing as much generation capacity as possible. And that didn't happen. The second thing that I fundamentally disagree with is, first of all, I was calling for the IRP. I called and called and called for the IRP before it was issued in 2019. When it came out, it was a huge disappointment. Let me stress why. The IRP is based on outdated information. Its modeling is already 3 years out of date. It's more than 3 years out of date. It works on an energy availability factor of 74% for Eskom. We know that it's barely 60%. We know that Grand Inga in the Democratic Republic of Congo is not going to come online before 2030. In fact, it's unlikely to come online at all. We know that a nuclear new build will take 15 years at the very least to provide any electricity to the grid. So the reality is we might as well throw that IRP out and do everything we can in our power to bring new generation capacity online through private producers, through independent power producers. That's what needs to happen. And Gwede Mantashe, for all that he speaks the right language, he is not an implementer. He's not the one who raised the cap from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. Cyril Ramaphosa had to twist his arm and twist it quite hard to make him do that. We need to take decisive action. We need to take bold steps to make South Africa's energy security happen. We need to allow new power producers onto the grid. We need to strengthen our grid infrastructure. We need to provide battery and pumped storage resources to make sure that we have dispatchable power when we need it, at the time that we need it. We need to incentivize small-scale embedded generation. And by small-scale embedded generation, I'm talking about the homeowner or the small business owner. We need to incentivize them to put solar panels on their roof. We need to make sure that the load on Eskom is reduced so that they can do what they need to do to maintain their existing fleet of coal and nuclear power stations. That's what needs to happen in the short term, and that's why Gwede Mantashe must go.
Kopano, let me come back to you. You know, Brian talks about a crisis situation that requires crisis intervention. Much of what the minister sought to do this afternoon is really give South Africans a sense that he's in charge of the situation and that Eskom has matters under control. Is it likely that we're going to see any further intervention beyond what has been said here tonight?
Kathy, that is the most critical question. In fact, if we recall, Eskom has a debt balance of over 350 billion rand. That, unfortunately, is not going away because even operationally, they are not able to generate the revenues that they need. And so at some point, the conversation will have to begin about an intervention, which is a financial intervention, in order to assist in some of the structural impediments that we know are plaguing Eskom, including how quickly we can get some of the IPPs on the grid, Kathy. A lot of the challenges that Eskom faces with getting enough IPP power onto the grid is the grid itself needs significant maintenance in order to accommodate all this new electricity. And Eskom have often said this to us when they take us through the many tours of the various power stations, that process will take billions of rands as well and is not as immediate as we would like. But in addition to that, everything that they try and do, maintaining existing power plants, trying to manage nuclear power plants, all of that needs finances in the range of 9 to 12 billion rand a year. And we know that Eskom cannot generate that income on its own operationally, and that South African government has now said they're not willing to fund Eskom in terms of its operation costs, but will only support it where it has some debt that it is owed or debt that it needs to pay back to some of our international creditors. That is where government will play a role. In addition, Kathy, Andre de Ruyter has been quoted in the Business Day as saying that South Africa does not have the capacity to build any new power stations given where we are and where we come from. And so that will also determine how we use independent power players in South Africa, as well as how we use our existing funding in order to get more power to more people.
All right, Kopano, of course, we seem to be really managing the crisis, right? Moving from one end of the spectrum, which is more severe and perhaps less severe. So with this deal being struck with workers, what does that mean? When can South Africans expect some sense of stability again? Is it too soon to tell?
Well, we anticipate that workers will be back at least by Friday once they have agreed on the deal that has been put forward, if not over the weekend. But as we understand it right now, there are at least enough staff to keep the power generation active. And Andre de Ruyter has made a commitment to continue to engage with media and the public to give us an update on how soon we'll move from stage 2 or stage 6 to stage 4 and possibly even stage 2 as more people come back to work.
All right, Kopano, I'll leave it there with you for tonight. Kevin, let me come back to you. The reality is that we simply cannot go on like this, even if it is for the next 2 to 3 years. It's an untenable situation, not least of which for the country's economy.
Absolutely. Every day, load shedding costs us hundreds of billions of rands in lost gross domestic product. So we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to connect more generation to the grid. But part of that is being dealt with at a local level. So we're seeing municipalities take this into their own hands. And in doing so, they bypass the grid requirements. Remember that the grid is about long-distance transmission of electricity for the most part. So when you can connect an independent power producer next door to a municipality or even in a municipality, it alleviates those transmission requirements and they are able to take off the electricity at a local level. So there are ways and means to manage the situation in the short term. We're seeing that well-run municipalities, of which there are very, very few in South Africa, I think it's only about 30 odd out of 257 municipalities that are considered well-run. But we're seeing that those well-run municipalities are taking active steps to connect independent power producers, to procure additional electricity resources, to put solar panels on the roofs of their own buildings, for example, to alleviate their demand on Eskom and to alleviate the burden on businesses and ratepayers in those communities.
Brian, let me come to you. What are some of the unintended consequences of where we find ourselves today in terms of the power supply. And, you know, there was a point made by Kevin earlier that we could also be looking at a situation where we are working towards a projected power supply based on demand that could well be outdated.
Absolutely. I think Kevin and I have referred to the same problems with the integrated resource plan. I would agree that it's outdated. The energy availability factor, he just added the specific numbers. But I think therein lies the difficulty in trying to plan for something like this. It worked 30, 40 years ago when Eskom played a specific role. The role that Eskom needs to play today is primarily on the transmission grid, primarily being able to connect customers and generators. And the generation that they provide is obviously also important, but more and more of the generation capacity will come from other sources. Technology has changed, commercial models have changed. You can now build much smaller generation facilities than you could in the past, where massive coal-fired power stations were the way to go. I'm about to put on something like 6 kilowatts on my own roof. That's fundamentally smaller than what a Medupi is. So that's the sort of thing that Kevin's been talking about. But there's also the opportunity to build 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, and let's not stop at 100 megawatts. Why not 500? Why not 1,000? If there are big companies, you will have seen NERSA have also really come to the party lately. A couple of weeks ago, there were 16 projects registered. The biggest of those in that particular round was 80 megawatts. A few weeks before that, there were 2 projects of 100 megawatts. Some of those opportunities could be higher than that. So there are opportunities in municipalities where you don't even need to come in from outside, from the transmission grid that's owned by Eskom. You can generate within your municipalities. There are a couple of municipalities working on that, and I think we're behind the times even in that. So you can look at micro generation, rooftop. You can look at big factories putting up the 2, 5, 10 megawatts. You can look at other businesses procuring 20, 50, 100 megawatts. And you can look at some of the really big industries in the country procuring 100, 200, 300 megawatts. And importantly, some of the new Schedule 2 regulations allow a generation facility to sell to multiple clients. Now you would wonder why any factory would be built for a single client. The risk profile of that is just enormous. Of course you need a factory, whether you're making pens, motor vehicles, or electrons, should be able to sell to lots and lots of users. It dilutes your risk. It makes it so much more possible for the investment to flow. So there are solutions at different levels, both in terms of the size of the generator, the size of the customer. There's different solutions in municipalities directly connected to Eskom. So all of these solutions need to be looked at as they are being done within the Operation Vulindlela context. And I think that's part of what we can focus on is, as South Africans, we've solved massive crises before. We can bound together and solve this one as well. But it's not going to be solved in 2 or 3 years without crisis intervention.
Brian Day, he's an energy analyst and with the South African Independent Power Producers Association, a committee member there. Kevin Mileham, he's the DA Shadow Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. And you also heard from our business reporter, Kopano Gumbi.